A while back I saw my first Edixa Reflex camera, and I thought that it was one of the most beautiful cameras I'd seen. So I set about looking for one, and ended up with a working example, complete with its original box and user manual, an old Gosson exposure meter, again complete with manual, a cable release, plus a few other oddments, and not forgetting the original leather carry case as well. Of course, the seller saying that the camera was working was slightly incorrect. None of the slow shutter speeds were working. The lens looked like it had been previously cleaned with a Brillo pad. The film advancing lever didn't return by itself after winding the film, and the focal plane shutter wasn't working correctly. I'll touch on some of the repairs I had to do later in the video, but for now let's take a look at the gorgeous camera itself. From what I can tell, my Edixa Reflex is a Model 2, or maybe a Model A, dating from around 1956 or thereabouts. The Edixa cameras were made by Wirgin in Wiesbaden in Germany. The camera features interchangeable lenses using an M42 screw mount. The 50mm Steinheil Munchen f2.8 Cassar lens on my camera has had a bit of a hard life, and the front element is pretty badly scratched through aggressive cleaning, but it still produces some pretty nice images when put on a digital camera, with a slightly mystical glow around bright objects. The early Edixa Reflex like mine doesn't have an automatic aperture, so you have to remember to stop down before taking the shot, something I forgot to do on at least one occasion. Also on the front of the camera we have sockets for electronic flash and flash bulbs, the difference between the two being the point in the exposure when the flash is triggered. Above those is the shutter release button, which has a really nice feel to it that doesn't appear to promote shake as you gently squeeze it in. Moving on to the top of the camera, there's a lever to advance the film with a frame counter around the edge. You have to manually reset this to 0 after you insert a film. Next to that is the shutter speed dial, which is in two sections. The upper section selects speeds from 1/1000th of a second down to 1/25th of a second, and also the bulb setting. You just lift up the outer ring and rotate it until the speed you want lines up with the dot in the middle part. Then there's the lower section, which deals with the slow shutter speeds. First you set the upper dial to its slowest speed of 1/25th of a second, and then you can select between 1/10th of a second, 1/5th of a second, half a second, and a full second. When you're not using the slow shutter speeds, the lower section should be set to 0. Over on the left there's the rewind knob, which is used to rewind the film into its canister once you've finished the roll. This is used in conjunction with the film drive release button located on the underside of the camera. There's also an aide-memoire around the edge that you can use to remind yourself what type of film you have in the camera. This isn't connected to an exposure meter or anything like that, it's purely as a reminder for the photographer. Then in the centre we have one of the killer features of the Edixa Reflex, a waist level viewfinder, which could be swapped out for a prism viewfinder. Not that Wirgin was the only brand to offer this feature. Anyway, I'll pop the waist level viewfinder back in and open the doors by pressing this button at the back, revealing absolutely nothing, because this camera doesn't have an auto return mirror, so you have to advance the film to lower the mirror. And now we have an image. There's a little flip-up magnifier to help you get focus, but when the Cassar lens is attached it's almost impossible to see when you're in focus because it's so soft. It's even difficult with that lens on a digital camera, but that's probably just my rather battered copy of the lens. Focusing is a tad easier when I've fitted one of my other M42 fit lenses. Using the viewfinder is definitely an experience and not something to be rushed. The image is back to front, so when you think you need to move left, you actually have to move to the right. The same applies to squaring up the image, but you fairly soon get used to it. I haven't mastered shooting in portrait with the waist level finder. You have to stand side on, and up is down, and squaring up the shot just tends to fry my brain. I'm sure I'd get used to it, but for now I'm just shooting everything landscape. On the underside of the camera we have the film drive release button and the tripod mount, which has this little pull-out section to stop the camera from toppling forwards when a lens is attached. On the rear are the two buttons that release the viewfinder and the film door, which is opened by sliding up this lever on the right hand side. Inserting a film is pretty simple. Just pull up the rewind knob, drop in your roll of film and push the rewind knob back in, giving it a little turn if necessary. Then drag the film over to the take-up spool and insert it in the slot, which may not be visible, but you can rotate that by hand until the slot is accessible. Now you can advance the film and fire the shutter, and then check that the film is sitting neatly between the raised sides of the film plane and that the drive sprocket is engaged with the holes. And then you can close the door and press down the latch. Now, before you take a shot, you want to wind on the exposed leader of the film. It's worth taking up any slack in the film canister by rotating the rewind knob in the direction of the arrow until you feel a tiny bit of tension. And now when you advance the film you should see the rewind knob rotate at the same time. This is a good confirmation that the film is spooling correctly. And then fire that shot, and wind on again, and fire that shot too. And now set the frame counter to 0, only rotating it in the direction of the arrow, otherwise it has a tendency to unscrew the retaining disc. And you're ready to take some photographs. Anyway, the first film I've put through this camera is now back from processing, so we can have a look at a few of the shots before I talk about some of the repairs the camera needed. As I mentioned earlier, there were a fair few things wrong with this camera when I got it. The lens was filthy and very scratched. I've done what I can with that, but it won't be the best example of a 50mm f2.8 Cassar ever seen. The slow speed shutter timer wasn't working, but the timer on the Edixa Reflex is by far the easiest to work on of any camera I've fixed. It was just a case of removing the bottom cover and removing one lever that gets in the way, and then scribing some marks so the timer could be replaced in its original position. It has oversized holes to allow for adjustment. Then once removed, I was able to dunk the entire module in alcohol and operate it several times to clean all the components. Once dry, the pivots for each gear were lubricated with a clock oiler. The gears, like a clock, should not be oiled themselves. Then it was just a case of reassembling, and I had working slow shutter speeds. Once that was done, it became apparent that there were more issues. The rear curtain wasn't sitting square, and it's clear that the camera had either had a curtain replacement at some time, or the curtain had come unstuck from the drum and the tapes weren't re-glued squarely. I opted for the easier option in this case and restitched one of the ribbons so that the curtain now sits squarely and isn't all baggy at the bottom. I also needed to get the top covers off, partly to clean and lubricate and partly to reattach the spring for the film advancing lever, which had been left detached when the camera was last serviced. This raised another problem. The disc on top of the winder originally had an M2 thread protruding from the bottom, which sheared off when I tried to undo it. That left me with the broken off thread stuck in the top of the axle beneath. Rather handily, I was able to cut a slot in the end of the broken thread, and after removing the complete axle, I was able to use a blowtorch to soften the glue someone had used and extract the broken thread. Upon examination, the thread had been stripped, and I assume it was then superglued in place to get the camera working again. Anyway, we drilled out the disc and added a countersink, so now that whole section can be assembled using a standard M2 screw. I will at some time swap that for a slotted screw, so it's more in keeping with the rest of the camera, but it's fine for the time being. And no, I didn't maul the top of the disc, that was done by a previous owner. Once all that was done and I'd tested the camera thoroughly, it was time to put a film in it. So here are some more shots. Using an Edixa Reflex, particularly an older version like this, is definitely something where you need to enjoy the process, because it is all rather involved. Firstly, arrive at the location where you want to take your photograph. Withdraw a suitable exposure meter from your back pocket, and take a reading. Enter that reading onto the exposure calculator on the front of the meter. Replace your exposure meter in your pocket for safekeeping. Open the viewfinder hatch and advance the film in order to actually see through the viewfinder. Set the shutter to the desired speed and flip up the tiny magnifier. Reach into your other pocket for a pair of reading glasses so you have any chance of seeing what's in that tiny viewfinder screen. Focus carefully on your subject, remembering from here on not to change your distance from said subject. Flip the tiny magnifier back down and choose your framing. Once happy, dial in your aperture setting, being careful not to knock the focus in the process. Attempt to confirm that your framing is still correct, bearing in mind that having stopped down the lens, the image is so dark that you can hardly see anything at all. Assuming the lighting hasn't changed and your subject hasn't fallen over, you can now take your photo. And relax, safe in the knowledge that you have another marvellous shot under your belt. Seriously though, it's difficult to describe how satisfying it is to use this camera. It feels so well built and everything sounds beautifully engineered and smooth. The camera weighs in at around 800 grams with the Cassar installed, so it's quite a chunk of metal. I like the shots my battered Cassar lens produces, but I don't so much like using it on this camera. It's just too difficult to focus, unless I'm using zone focusing or hyperfocal focusing. So a fair few of the shots in this video have been taken either with a 35mm Isco Gottingham Edixa Westramat f2.8 or my slightly radioactive 55mm Mamiya Secor f1.8. Anyway, here are a few more sample shots. As ever, I'm just enjoying the process of shooting film. I'm not trying to create the best work of art in the world, and I'm definitely having to relearn my thinking in black and white, having been spoilt by digital for so many years. Naturally, there were some failed shots, but possibly less than you'd imagine. This shot of a railway station was supposed to be taken at something like f11. I'd set the focus to the hyperfocal markings, then I forgot to stop down the lens. So not only was the shot overexposed by a few stops, but leaving the lens wide open, the only things in focus would be about 10 feet away. The shot should have looked something like this. The next shot I made a mess of was this one of some steps. It's fairly dim lighting, so I intended to shoot at 1/25th of a second, but I must have knocked the lower speed setting, so when I took the shot I ended up taking it something like 1/5th of a second. I can hold a camera steady at 1/25th, but definitely not at 1/5th, so this one is a bit shaky. This is what it should have looked like. So, do I like using the Edixa Reflex? Well, that has to be a resounding yes. It's maybe not the one I'd choose for photographing sports, but for overall satisfaction it's hard to beat. I think that just about covers it for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.